Americans are worried about the economy. Consumer confidence in where the economy is headed hit a 12-year low in March 2025.
Consumer sentiment is oftentimes more predictive than people's objective financial situation.
Even though Americans are worried about the economy, they seem to be spending more. Roughly 1 in 5 Americans are shopping out of fear of future price hikes, dubbed doom spending.
Wow. That is quite a few people. 1 in 5 is a pretty solid percentage. I've certainly heard this phrase. I was not expecting them to reference this on a news video, but I'm curious to see what they're actually going to cover here as part of this.
Doom spending is making impulsive purchases, largely driven out of fear over what the future may bring. In some cases, it's a kind of retail therapy, but it can also be a strategy to get ahead of economic uncertainty.
I'm not sure if retail therapy is an appropriate phrase. It is a phrase people use, but I do feel like it sort of normalizes consumerism, which is likely unhealthy. I think that some folks can actually get overly dependent on shopping to sort of give them sort of like a jolt of dopamine and sort of become shopping addicts in some form or another. And so that seems like an overly nice way of describing it. It might give a false sense of what that actually entails. Like self-medicating implies like a sort of scientific or medical approach to trying to help yourself feel better or be better or healthier, when in many cases that just means like kind of overindulging in drugs or alcohol in some context. And I feel like this is a similar topic where we don't see shopping or consumerism, especially in America, as necessarily a bad thing to do, or even in excess, we sort of normalize it. But this is certainly something that I think is negatively impacting a number of folks. And just wanted to caution for some of that terminology there. I've certainly heard it before, but for me, I think it almost masks the problem that really exists.
People are worried for a number of really reasonable reasons. We as humans hate uncertainty and are averse to volatility. And so when there's whiplash happening at a national level as to what tariffs are happening with which country and how it's going to affect our domestic industries, that makes people really nervous. People are concerned when they go to the grocery store and they continue to see rising prices.
It's not just consumers who are concerned. Major companies, the Federal Reserve, and Wall Street are all signaling uncertainty. The S&P 500 dropped 10% from record highs in February, suggesting investor fears over an economic slowdown. Here's why Americans are spending more even in tough times, and what that means for the economy.
Starting in February, when people started to get nervous about tariffs and how it might impact them. And most people do expect that there will be some financial hit from some of the trade tensions that are going on right now.
So one question that often gets asked is why, when people feel economic uncertainty, why would a subset of the population go out and increase their spending?
For some, shopping can serve as a way to hedge their future spending.
I expect rising prices to happen tomorrow, therefore I'm going to consume today as a way of saving money.
Economists say that Trump's tariffs on imports from Canada, China, and Mexico are bound to raise prices on a wide range of consumer goods, things that we buy every day. So most consumers are rightfully concerned about that. People expect that these tariffs will impact them, and in many cases they will. So a lot of times consumers are trying to get ahead of it by buying things now instead of waiting when the price may be higher.
For others, it may not be that clear-cut.
We also have to recognize that we are beautiful humans with a beautiful imperfect brain. And so oftentimes when we feel a lack of control, we try to grab onto anything that we can control and increase our hedonic adaptation and increase our mood.
Consumers spent less than anticipated in February 2025, according to the latest retail sales numbers. But the overall sales still showed steady growth. This is despite concerns over an economic slowdown and rising inflation.
Going into 2025, things were looking pretty stable, but some of the economic data recently has been a little all over the place, and that is because there's sort of been this seesaw with trade policy and a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen next. Consumer spending has really been the engine that is keeping our economy on stable ground.
Even the Federal Reserve is in wait-and-see mode. The FOMC was hesitant to adjust interest rates at its March 2025 meeting without clearer economic signals. Some experts warn that the spending pattern, along with tariff uncertainty, could be setting the economy up for a downturn.
Our thoughts and expectations oftentimes become reality because we act on these thoughts and expectations. If I think prices are going to increase tomorrow, what happens is I'm going to go out and spend today. What does that do? Well, sadly, it gets us into the cycle where it increases demand that suppliers can't meet, and so therefore it increased prices.
But there are really
I think they just chose to show like Costco or something like that here.
Can't meet, and so therefore it increased prices.
But there really is that risk that once spending starts to slow down, the economy could.
Where it increased.
There we go. Yeah, this is a Costco right here. So I think it's hard for anyone to look like they're a normal spender at Costco. I feel like this poor lady was used as the example, even though like half of what she has here is toilet paper. But I'm sure that is costing quite a bit for her. I do think this is a problem that does exist, and this is exactly where market sentiment can lead to crashes, and why sometimes the market doesn't crash when we would expect it to, is because it depends on how optimistic or pessimistic people are at that current point in time. And so this is where it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in certain scenarios, where it doesn't happen on an individual basis, but when we collectively have these thoughts and we start pushing the market in certain scenarios, bad things can happen. This is exactly why like the market starts to go down, is people have lower expectations for it. And then people start to sell because they think, okay, this is the high point. It's going to get worse, so I want to sell my shares. And then maybe as more and more people do that, basically people start to get into a rush of selling. And so then they're willing to take kind of a cut to kind of get out and say to themselves, well, I'd rather lose 1 or 2% now than lose 10 or 20% in 6 months or whenever they think it's going to happen. And then that actually causes the decrease that they're worried about, because they are rushing to get out of there and they're willing to take a cut for it. Then somebody else has to take a cut on top of that. And then it kind of just spirals out of control. But this is where it matters in mass, because if only 1 or 2 people are doing this, then while everyone else is optimistic, then it won't really cause any issues. So it's really where this balance occurs, where when the number of people who are pessimistic about the economy outnumber the number of optimists about the economy, then that's where like prices can start to drop down in a sizable way. And same thing with spending, which is like if there's a lot of demand for certain things, I think we've all seen this for our grocery stores when there's a big storm coming, you know, maybe some essentials of like milk or bread or eggs, those types of things. I think flour, for instance, or yeast in COVID times. This is where there might have been enough for everybody to have, but because everybody was sort of rushing to hoard it all, that they actually created the shortage of people not being able to gain access to it just because the fear was there. And so I think these are scenarios that we encounter somewhat regularly at varying sizes where this is the case.
This is demand that suppliers can't meet, and so therefore it increased prices.
But there really is that risk that once spending starts to slow down, the economy could turn down, or we could even face a possible recession. So there's that wave of uncertainty that's taking hold, and the consumer outlook is significantly lower than it was just a few months ago. Most people expect that their finances will take a hit this year, and that itself can pump the brakes on the economy.
While this spending might seem to prop up the economy, it could be coming at a cost.
One of the big drawbacks about doom spending is that it can really prompt you to overspend. So if you are making extra purchases or doom spending in ways that just don't fit in the budget, it's pretty unsustainable. In fact, if you're leaning on credit cards to make some of these purchases, then you're paying a very high interest rate.
Credit card debt has surged past $1.2 trillion, and 34% of borrowers are taking on even more debt this year. Experts suggest people take a step back and reassess their finances to better prepare for what may be ahead.
I will tell people, love yourself enough to take a financial health day and tick off the things that you know you should have done yesterday, right? Whether or not it's like cancel that delivery app that you know it's charging you higher prices on top of the delivery fees on top of XYZ, or whether or not it's canceling that subscription, or whatever your financial situation is. Everything takes time. So give yourself that time. Take that financial health day.
The thing is that most Americans are doing pretty well right now. I mean, we've had a prolonged period where most people had jobs and rising wages. So that's put a lot of households in a pretty stable situation, but that can change. And the thing is, if people are increasingly stretched financially, then their situation is a little more precarious. The thing about doom spending that is dangerous is that people should be saving now instead of spending now. If you build up that financial cushion, it puts you in a much...
Yeah, it's a great point that this individual is covering, which is if you're worried about financial instability or issues in the future, trying to buy some goods, I would say especially anything that's like consumable goods right now, is probably not going to make a lot of sense. I think if you're thinking to yourself, wow, I need a new car, maybe if you can time it well enough that you can get in before like the tariffs hit and drastically increase the prices, like that could make sense for you. But generally speaking, just saving more money is going to set you up for the best possible scenario, and being prepared for some uncertainty will help you out the most. And so I think that's definitely key there, where doom spending, I think, is one of the things that's actually setting you back potentially if you're participating in this type of behavior. And so it could actually be, again, sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're worried about your financial scenario, and so you're doom spending, and then you maybe are spending more than what you can financially handle, and then you're going to be in a bad financial scenario. And so this is where you should be making sure that you are making financial decisions based off of financial criteria for the most part, and not emotional behavior, because this is where a lot of mistakes can be made, and they can be very costly for yourself, especially taking on debt can be very negative and can really take you a while to come out of it, depending on how large of a debt that is that you're taking on.
More protected place given the future uncertainty. So no matter what happens, if you have that safety net, you're better off than if you buy a bunch of stuff now and don't necessarily need it or want it or use it later on.
We know that we can increase our individual happiness, not when we spend on material things, but when we spend on experiences, and when we spend on experiences with others, because that goes into our everlasting memory bank. If you are going to engage in this behavior because you're just like, I just need to feel good in this moment, well, then let's try to maximize that feeling for the long.
So that description that she just highlighted sounds a lot like some type of addictive behavior and triggers. And so again, I think this is something where if you're saying this to yourself, you should probably start asking yourself, like, is this a potential addiction? You know, maybe it's not that serious for you right now, or maybe you say these things jokingly. But I think this is where, for some people, they can really get into trouble this way. Not all that dissimilarly from like a gambling addiction, where they're chasing that high on like this great moment that just lasts for a split second when they get that win, and then they have loss after loss after loss. And so buying something that seems nice and, you know, might spark joy for you in that moment, but you then have to keep paying for the next 6 months or a year as you whittle down that debt, might not necessarily benefit you in the long term. And so I would encourage folks who are having some of these thoughts to really take a moment and ask yourself, like, is this something that you're actually acting on? Is this something you act on regularly? And you should potentially look within yourself, or maybe even seek some type of help on this matter. Again, I don't really see a huge difference here between these type of impulses and like other addictions. And so I feel like in America, we sort of normalize this and it's almost expected that you do these things. And I think that is a shame. I think for so many people, they're probably hurting themselves in not very obvious ways. And they don't see it as necessarily a problem yet. And they kind of get away with that behavior right now. And it might take them a long time before they can help get on the right track. And so if you yourself are thinking about these things, or you know somebody else who is doing about these, maybe you should have a chat with that individual and see if they need help in another way. There's other forms of trying to make yourself feel better. You could exercise, you could invest in your relationships, you could spend more time with your loved ones. There's so many other things that you can be doing. And so if you feel like this is the primary way that you're trying to do this, it's likely going to not end well for you or that individual in that case.
Long term, instead of buying, some frivolous material purchase that you're going to forget about in the future.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.